Freedom is never granted, it is won. A community is democratic only when the humblest and weakest person can enjoy the highest civil, economic, and social rights that the biggest and most powerful possess. Those words were spoken by A. Philip Randolph, one of America's greatest Black labor leaders. His work for the predecessing fights of the Civil Rights Movement led to influencing powerful politicians to finally put a stop to discrimination within the employment market. President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which prohibited, quote, discrimination in the employment of workers in the defense industries and in government because of race, creed, color, or national origin, end quote. Nearly 1.2 million Blacks served in the Second World War, and those that stayed behind took over public service positions, participated in industrial workforces, and joined labor unions to protect their rights. Tensions had already been brewing between white and Black Americans since the turn of the century, when people of color were slowly granted more privileges in the country they called home. This tension grew to an explosive head during the early summer of 1943, of what would later be known as the 1943 Detroit Race Riot. Before diving into details of one of many racial-based riots to come, it's important that we give context to this issue by examining the political and social points of contention immediately prior to the event. In the early 1940s, the major city of Detroit was a booming town of manufacturing and a large production hub for many goods during the Second World War. Dubbed the Arsenal of Democracy by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Detroit became well known as the largest contributor of large-scale weaponry shipments for the war effort when automobile manufacturing came to a swift halt upon the U.S. entering the battle. Men of every race were drafted to fight overseas and represent their country in World War II, leaving many jobs open for out-of-towners to make their mark in this industrialized city. Those who migrated to the north from the south had high hopes for employment and economic opportunity, in addition to feeling a sense of pride with assisting the war effort. For the first time in history, women were taking jobs outside of the home as their husbands fought for freedom, and Black men and women, who before now had been relegated to the most dangerous and undesirable jobs, were now participating in more dignified professions than ever. Highways were being constructed to aid in the transporting of goods, and families who longed to be part of the cause grew their own vegetables to alleviate pressure on the public food supply, aptly named them as Victory Gardens. The American dream was looking like a real possibility for those who never stood a chance in this burgeoning nation of ours. Unfortunately, the boosted morale that the war provided for citizens didn't last long. Plenty of job opportunities led to a great deal of competition for fair wages, stable housing, and a higher quality of life than had been left behind. As the mental stress weighed heavily on them, many Black men considering joining the war began to wonder if it was even worth fighting for a country that does not see them as fully human. Some whites gained a new sense of respect for their fellow soldiers, but others remained closed-minded, and the addition of Black soldiers only furthered their hatred and racism. Groups such as the KKK profited off of white fear, that Black men and women were bound to take every white person's job and infringe upon their way of life entirely. Efforts to fight against blatant discrimination were quickly labeled as fascist organizations, made all the more heavy of a sentiment with the political climate of the time. To add to the existing tension between races, many factories in Detroit did not offer any housing options to those that migrated north to find work, resulting in a disproportionate amount of Black Americans being left by the wayside to find their own homes in unfamiliar territory. Whites in segregated neighborhoods were vehemently against Blacks living near or around their community, so there was little choice but for Black families to reside in deplorable conditions elsewhere. In 1941, the Detroit Housing Commission, in conjunction with federal funding, approved the creation of the Sojourner Truth Housing Project, consisting of 200 units to support and house Black workers during the war. White neighbors were outraged at this and protested in the neighborhood in which the construction was set to take place, arguing that the only occupancy of these buildings should be whites, and Blacks had no business taking housing options away from them. Federal authorities gave in to these demands, promising the white protesters that housing specifically for Blacks would be built further away. However, they made no effort to secure an alternative site for the housing project, and Black workers took it upon themselves to fight for the housing they deserved. Black Americans were outraged at this reversal, and peaceful assemblies of thousands of supporters gathered in Cadillac Square in downtown Detroit. Construction of these buildings in 1942 faced violent backlash from whites and civil protests from blacks along the way, ultimately resulting in the Michigan National Guard being called in to escort black families into their new home on move-in day. On February 28, 1942, thousands upon thousands of black supporters and white opponents filled the streets in droves. Whites lit crosses on fire and spouted bigoted insults towards those moving in. Blacks defended themselves with little support from law enforcement, as many stood back and allowed the torment to continue. At the end of the violent protest, once the police began rounding up all citizens participating, nearly 220 people were arrested, with around 40 people injured. A large majority of those arrested and hurt, Black. For years to come after this heinous display of racist ideals, public housing funding and plans were shot down time and time again, with the Detroit Housing Commission even vowing that any future projects would, quote, not change the racial pattern of a neighborhood, end quote. In essence, the whites won, and the fear of upsetting a race with more political and social standing was on the forefront of government officials' minds. The housing crisis in the city was not solved by any means, and the divide between the races furthered with more confrontations to come. All the while, white factory employees refused to continue working as long as their black counterparts kept being promoted to higher positions in the industry. This culminated in a significant slowdown in wartime production that was desperately needed as World War II ramped up. This prelude leads us to a warm summer day in June of 1943. On the 20th of June, thousands of young black and white residents began fighting opponents of the opposite race at Belle Isle Park near the Detroit River, a popular amusement park at the time. Law enforcement became involved early on to suppress the violence, but the many teens and adults leaving the park at the same time resulted in major traffic jams that only created more hostility towards one another. The rioting that had taken over the city began once more, as nearly 5,000 white residents engaged in altercations with hundreds of black residents attempting to cross the Belle Isle Bridge back home to the mainland. Adding fuel to an already inextinguishable fire, two rumors began circulating amongst the crowds. A man claiming to be a police sergeant stated that a group of whites had thrown a black woman and her baby off the side of the Belle Isle Bridge. This incited a mob of black residents that moved from Hastings Street towards Woodward Avenue, looting businesses belonging to white owners and attacking any white individual they encountered. On the other side of the battle, a mob of furious whites came together after hearing the rumor that a black man had raped a white woman near the same bridge. With the white mob marching up Woodward Avenue as well, they converged into a violent bloodbath that had been built up to a point that could no longer be contained. As whites overturned cars driven by blacks and set them on fire in Paradise Valley, the mayor finally responded to the riots, seeking help from the National Guard along with the president. 6,000 federal army troops swarmed the streets of Detroit by midnight, threatening any residents that dared to leave their home. Every school, business, and place of amusement was immediately shut down, and order was restored within the city limits.
Westbound. You want me to go and come back in eastbound? That's affirmative.
Even though the riot of 1943 only lasted around a day, the emotional effects it had on American citizens lasted a lifetime, with elements of this riot showing up in later spurs of violence, including the deadliest urban riot in America, the 1967 Detroit riot. 25 black residents, along with 9 white residents, had been killed during the violence, with 17 of the black residents being killed at the hands of white officers. Destroyed storefronts and a defeated police force represented a manifestation of racism in the city of Detroit. Even the subsequent investigation of the cause and nature of the riot by Governor Kelly's appointed committee labeled the city's black population as the catalyst for the consequential violence. President FDR ignored the problem and took no action to help prevent the riots that followed from occurring. The Axis powers noted this incident along with many others during the time as an indication of weakness and inequality within the U.S. Propaganda even targeted black soldiers to come and support the war effort behind Axis lines. As a creative response to the outpouring of violence in the summer of 1943, poet Langston Hughes wrote Beaumont to Detroit, 1943. His commentary in regards to the oppression of blacks across the country related the discrimination to that of the relevant issue of Jews living under Nazi rule. Hughes' reflection connected the industrial cities of Detroit, Michigan, with Beaumont, Texas, another city which sparked outrage caused by false rumors of racially motivated crime just days before the Detroit riot took place. Published in the journal Common Ground in the fall of 1943, the poem is as follows. Looky here, America. What you done, done. Let things drift until the riots come. Now you're policemen. Let the mobs run free. I reckon you don't care nothing about me. You tell me that Hitler is a mighty bad man. I guess he took lessons from the Ku Klux Klan. You tell me Mussolini's got an evil heart. Well, it must have been in Beaumont that he had his start. 'Cause everything that Hitler and Mussolini do, Negroes get the same treatment from you. You Jim Crowed me before Hitler rose to power, and you're still Jim Crowing me right now, this very house. Yet you say we're fighting for democracy? Then why don't democracy include me? I ask you this question because I want to know how long I gotta fight, both Hitler and Jim Crow. My name is Victoria Kreeft, and I thank you for listening.